What's up, witches? Welcome to another episode of season 2 of the BetterWitch podcast, presented by the Modern Witch Network. I'm your host, Allie, aka BronxWitch. I'm a tarot reader, Reiki master, and owner of BronxWitch HeadQuarters, a spiritual shop and workshare space in the Bronx, New York. And I'm going to be coming to you every week with a new topic and a guest co host to talk about our real life experiences as practicing witches. Because when we know better, we witch better. Today's guest co host is Yvonne Aburrow. Yvonne has been a pagan since 1985 and a Wiccan since 1991. They have an MA in Contemporary Religions and Spiritualities from Bath Spa University in the UK and have written 4 books on mythology and folklore. Their most recent works are All Acts of Love and Pleasure, Inclusive Wicca, and Dark Mirror, The Inner Work of Witchcraft, which, by the way, BronxWitch Coven Book Club will be reading later this year. Yvonne lives in Cambridge, Ontario, Canada, blogs for dowsingdivinity.com, and can be found on Instagram at Yvonne Aburrow. I think that that's right in alignment with what we're going to be talking about today because as we start to come back together and start to form groups and interact with, I mean, obviously, inclusivity is important in the virtual space as well, but as we're beginning to come together and create groups that meet in person, I do think that we've learned a lot as a collective through the quarantine and the pandemic and since 2020. And I think that there's a stronger urge among all walks of life, but probably particularly amongst witches, to make sure that we are creating inclusive spaces, that we are being compassionate, open, kind, welcoming, warm, to all of those who are embracing the craft and maybe stepping into it for the first time. I really love seeing coven members, folks who participate on my platforms and things like that, connect with each other in real life. And Yvonne's going to teach us how to do that. All how to do that, how we can come together in a way where everyone wins, everyone is welcome.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you should mention that because I think one of the things I really appreciate about all of the events, the pagan events now in Canada, is that they tend to have a code of conduct, which includes inclusivity and also consent. And that's obviously, to me, consent and inclusivity are like two parts of a whole because. People rushing up to one of the things, so inclusivity, it's about I started on the angle of LGBT inclusion and including people with neurodivergence. And back in 2014, when I wrote All Acts of Love and Pleasure, I was a tiny bit naive and kind of thought, well, there's nothing in the craft that, there's nothing in Wicca, which is what I was writing about, that specifically excludes Black people or people of color in general. And the thing that, because the actual practice itself doesn't exclude anyone in that way, whereas it does exclude LGBT people. But what I hadn't thought of was like, full of white people being idiots. So, it's like, didn't think of that. So, but I did write about cultural appropriation, which is obviously a big piece of it as well.
Yeah.
And then, so that's sort of why I wrote the follow-up books, Dark Mirror and The Night Journey, which then talk more about, okay, how do we dismantle racism and white supremacy, which is obviously a very important aspect of being inclusive. And I mean, it's interesting because we're all going back to our ancestral practices, So how do we do that in a way that doesn't exclude people with different ancestral cultures,
Right.
and avoid stealing each other's ancestral practices?
Right, right. It's like, and inclusivity, is a broad term. I think something that's important to keep in mind is something that you have touched on in your writings and that you have mentioned, and that I'm hoping you'll talk more about is the difference between inclusivity and being welcoming. Because I think that witches, that Wiccans in particular, there are not a lot of writings, teachings, philosophies within the practice, within the religion, that exclude anybody. And you're certainly right. The polarity of the masculine versus the feminine, the male and female in Wicca definitely excludes LGBT folks pretty much on its face. Um, but outside of that, you don't have a lot of like blatant exclusion of folks. And I
Mm,
think that can create the misconception that like, well, then these are inclusive places, right? Because they don't say anything about being anti anybody or anything like that. And even to the end of the dichotomy of male and female being very heteronormative
mm,
in Wiccan spaces, you do see quite a lot of folks of LGBT identity participating in Wiccan spaces and being a part of Wiccan covens and things like that. So I think it would be easy to be like, oh, well, Wicca and other such practices are like totally inclusive. But there is a difference between being, just welcoming and sort of being generally ambiguous about it,
mm.
and really being inclusive, and making people actually a part of the fold, like of what we do and things like that. Um, so I'm curious for you, like, what do you think are the differences between being welcoming and being inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have written about that difference because I think people talk about, okay, well, we welcome the group, we welcome this group, that group, the other group, um, but if they don't change their practices from being heteronormative, um, is able normative, you know,
Yeah.
like um, and and white centric type, white, um, just accepting white centrism as the state, or Eurocentrism as the status quo, um, then they're not really being inclusive. So, you know, if you're marginalized by the practice itself, then you're not being included. And then some people would also say, well, there's a further stage from inclusion, which is affirming. Um, I mean, to me, it's like, um, I've written 3 or 4 blog posts, which got included in books, saying, are you just welcoming or are you actually inclusive?
Mm.
And then I've seen other people say, well, inclusive isn't enough. Actually, affirming is what you want.
Okay.
But to me, you're not properly inclusive unless you're also affirming.
Yeah. So.
If we don't, and part of being affirming is showing up to your local, um, protests in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, or you know, Indigenous solidarity, or whatever it happens to be. Um,
Mm.
and shout out to Indigenous people. Your protests are always on a Tuesday, which means I can't go.
No. Oh man.
Yeah,
Um,
because I'm at work. Like,
yeah.
local Black Lives Matter people put their protests on a Saturday, which means we can go.
Yes. Look at that. Timing is important, right?
Which is,
But okay. So I love that it seems like, yeah, I like that word that you said, like dismantling. Like it's an action. Like
yeah,
inclusivity is not a maybe that's the difference. That welcoming is passive. It's just sort of like, yeah, if you show up to our ritual. If you show up to our event, then like you will be allowed to enter, versus being like, we are going to meet you where you are and join in your fight and join in your activities or focus on things that are important to your communities, to let you know that we are invested in your well-being.
Yeah,
um, and, and,
absolutely.
and, and yeah, and so like, come hang out with us. We'll protest on Saturday, and then on Sunday we'll have like a Sabbath dinner. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Um,
And I mean, like celebrating, for instance, um, there's a group of people who've come up with a ritual which is called the trans rite of elevation.
mm,
Um, and what that involves is so it's 9 days um, between the Trans Day of Remembrance leading up to Samhain,
mm,
and people will spend 9 days and literally they're building an altar for trans ancestors, and like
oh,
bringing them in a way, bringing them in from the cold, because they're, a lot of them, particularly the ones who died in a traumatic way. Um, so it's a work of healing, and that was developed by the trans community, and I think it's a really beautiful thing. Um, but it should also be honoured by other people, you know.
mm-hmm.
Maybe we don't. Maybe we're, because it's pretty intense thing to do. So maybe people want to do a less intense version of it. But um, you know, Trans Day of Remembrance is for everyone, and it's in a way like, unfortunately, it's constantly re-traumatizing trans people to keep focusing on those deaths. So actually, Trans Day of Remembrance is for the rest of us to express solidarity. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I feel that way about a lot of days, holidays, moments of remembrance, memorials, etc., that are focused around Black suffering and Black violence and Black
mm,
death. Because oftentimes there's like a compulsion to like get on the internet and like post, and Martin Luther King Day or like all of these different things. And those are days that I tend to be really quiet,
mm,
because I feel like those are days for other people. Like for me, I don't want to kind of think about how those things that we were fighting for, 60, 70 years ago are still issues today. That's
yeah,
actually kind of upsetting and like triggering and like rehashing a wound. And so those are often days where I'm like not really saying a lot. And I'm really glad that you say that, because I think that that's an important thing that we as witches can do to let other witches know that they are a part of this community, is to kind of take up the mantle on the days when like they need to rest.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the really good hashtags that I enjoy on Instagram is witches against racism and witches against white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, those are really good. Once we got past the whole let's post a black square on Instagram, which was actually pretty unhelpful. Um,
I remember
yeah,
that. I do
I was
remember
quite
that.
pleased with myself. I did not post a black square. I posted Black Lives Matter instead.
Mm,
Um,
okay.
and then when people started criticizing the black square, I was like, ha.
Yeah.
Because actually, what you should be doing is sharing posts from BIPOC creators, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, not cluttering up the space with black squares. But yeah, like, what was I going to say? I think I really like it that Black History Month this year is about its black resistance, and black and subtext of it being black resilience. So there's an opportunity to talk about black joy, and
Yes.
um, I was writing a blog post about it for work, and I found this fantastic picture of Audre Lorde rowing across a lake,
Mm-hmm.
just looking really radiant with joy. And I was like, oh, that's perfect, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, I mean, the other thing that I'm always banging on about is intersectionality, because My post was about creating Black queer spaces, because that's a whole different category of safe space, right? So, and focusing on, again, the creation of Black and queer joy. And I think, it's just, we should be instead of constantly re-traumatizing people, as like, okay, how can we uplift the joyful aspects of resistance and community building and all that good stuff.
And let's talk about the how, because people, I feel like witches, and this might be just like totally overgeneralizing, but I feel like witches as a collective, maybe more than other groups of people, um, are concerned and invested in trying to create safe spaces, and being inclusive, and I think more importantly, just in having this conversation. I think conversations about inclusivity, about cultural appropriation, about things of that nature, white supremacy, are happening maybe more amongst us than other people. And I don't know if I'm totally biased, and it's just because like all of my Instagram is just like witchy people. But I feel like this is a very big, these are big topics in our community, and we are actually like tackling them and having these conversations. And so I'm really happy to see that happening. And so folks may be wondering, like, okay, well, if we are talking about this, if this is important to us, how do we actually do that? What does that actually look like? How does that play out? And I wanted to, bring people's attention to and share. And my apologies again, book club people. I always say this. I am not cheating. Okay, we are reading Dark Mirror: The Inner Work of Witchcraft in our book club later this year. And I promise you guys, I am not reading ahead. I did not, read a bunch of it. I did do a little flipping through and a little bit of research, because I was interested in the section on inclusive Wicca in particular, obviously for our conversation today. And so I just wanted to share a little bit from the book, because I think it's really helpful and will help us talk about some of the things that we have maybe experienced and seen be successful and helpful in like making people feel included and creating inclusivity. In Dark Mirror, in the Inclusive Wicca chapter, you said being inclusive means becoming aware of others' pain and working to support the oppressed and the marginalized. It means doing some work to make your rituals inclusive and healing for everyone, and understanding your own privilege, which you define as the degree to which your reality, your worldview, is considered normal and natural, the degree to which you are safe from oppression, and the extent to which your right to existence is not constantly questioned and undermined. And then you go on to give us a couple of boxes that we can kind of check off to answer the question of whether or not the coven we're involved with, or the group that we're involved with, is in fact inclusive. And some of those things that really stood out to me included allows invocation of any gender deity onto any gender human, respects members' genders and uses their pronouns, promotes consent culture, does not automatically exclude people with mental health issues, is body positive and does not allow fat shaming or body shaming, and does not insist that its members reach a specific educational level or belong to a specific socioeconomic class. And I thought that was, there are many more in there. I didn't want to spoil it all for you guys, for my book club folks who are going to get to read it themselves. But those are a few that really stood out to me, that I was like, man, I really feel like if we can check those things off, and make sure that we're doing them in a way like that we're actively doing them, where people know, like, this is a place where you can be these things. This is our rituals flow like this. We do not, gender align our deity worship, et cetera, then we'll really be in like a good place. And I'm wondering, maybe out of that list, or just out of other lists that you've compiled, what are some of the more helpful uh, points on lists like those that you think that, maybe if I'm starting a coven tomorrow, I should make sure I'm checking off from day one?
I think um, I think I'd start like I'd want to kind of come up with a summary of how to be inclusive, right? And that is, um, I mean, it's basically don't be a dick, uh,
That's
right? But
step one for sure.
yeah, um, but it's um, I guess it's the thing of create. Let's say you're starting out and it's just you, and then one other person comes along, and you know maybe they look different from you, or have a different life experience from you. So this, I guess, the first step would be just to sit down and share your life experiences and what you're hoping to get out of this coven, and what the concept of coven actually means to you, and um, also, it's things like, okay, these are my boundaries, and these are my hard boundaries, and these are my negotiable boundaries, um, and just sort of, and then also, like, if you're joining a specific practice, like Wicca is, initiatory Wicca, Gardnerian, Alexandrian, etc., um, tends to be, it's a tradition with a bunch of stuff that's been handed down to us, right? So we have to figure out how we're going to negotiate with that. And so a lot of my stuff is about, okay, how do I expand that practice and make it meaningful for me as a non-binary person, and other non-binary people and other LGBT people, um, so that we're not constrained within this heterocentric box. Um, and also, I've had a lot of neurodivergent people in my groups, and so I'm very mindful of how do we make sure that they're included and um, not excluded. Um, so I think to start with, it's just about, okay, the first step on the path is how do we avoid, if we're a coven of two or three or whatever, how do we avoid pissing each other off?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, and then expanding it from there. Because once you've got that negotiating, kind of consensual, collaborative, um, groundwork done, then that creates an inclusive space to start with.
Mm.
And then new people come along, and then the same negotiation happens with them.
Yeah, and I really thank you for that because I think that's like super powerful, because you can compile lists of like steps, where you can have these things that like, okay, these are boxes that I want to have checked off. These are things that I want to say that we do or that we say, etc. But it really kind of just starts with the very basic component of having a genuine interest and wanting to get to know people who are not like you,
Mm,
and rather than putting them into a box and making lots of assumptions about who they are and what they're about and what they need and what they'll be interested in or what they're capable of, etc. Um, really, truly wanting to have a relationship with somebody, that
yeah.
is different from you in some way. And having a relationship that incorporates this thing that you have in common, which is the craft.
Mm,
Um, so yeah, I really thank you. That I think that's like such a beautiful place to start for people because I think it gets rid of maybe some of the like head scratching, like, what does it mean to be inclusive? Are we doing it right? Are we including right? Like, are we checking all the things? Are we gonna get the stamp of approval for being like the inclusive group of the year? Um, it's a lot easier than that. You can just start with like, do you genuinely want to practice with people who are not like you in some way?
mm,
Um, and if so, then step one is just genuinely getting to know them, and letting them tell you what they need in order to be a part of that space, and then accommodating and figuring out how to make that happen, and then that's
Yeah.
where the actual action comes in.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is like, you know, the population ain't getting any younger. So it's things like, okay, does your ritual that you've got planned involve a lot of standing around? And if you've got people who can't stand around for ages, then provide some chairs.
Right.
And sometimes it's just really simple stuff like that. But I was at a ritual recently, and somebody said, brothers and sisters, and I went, and I was in my head, I was going, and siblings, and non-binary siblings, and I mentioned it to them, and then the next thing was that they included and siblings on the end of their thing, which was great. Yeah, so it's just that, open-mindedness and being, if somebody challenges you on, or gently calls you in, or whatever phrase you want to use, that you are prepared to just adjust and tweak things. Because I think a lot of the time, I think everyone has this thing, me included, right, that we all want to be seen as the perfectly virtuous, inclusive person all the time. And we're human, we're going to make mistakes. And I think it's sometimes, rather than sort of, when somebody says, well, actually, you missed out this thing, or you didn't include that thing, of being prepared to go, yeah, I'm sorry, I screwed up. Okay, let's do better next time.
Right. Let's correct it and move forward. And I was going to ask you about that, because you do focus a lot of your work on coven life, initiatory coven life, how to do work within these types of groups to make sure that they are open and inclusive spaces, that we, root out problems that might be sort of festering within these groups and things like that. So your focus is around a lot of group experiences, which for myself as a solitary practitioner and a lot of the folks that are listening, I'd imagine they may not really have had a lot of experience with group life. And so I'm very curious about your experiences with covens, with groups, festivals, fairs, etc. That maybe were not inclusive. You mentioned this one where someone was referring to just brothers and sisters and not thinking about other identities in the room. But I was hoping you'd maybe tell us a little bit about perhaps some of the things you saw that motivated you to write about this. Maybe you saw some things that were like, this is not
for
okay.
sure.
Let me write a manual on how we can do this better.
Well, the big starting point for me was, coming into the craft in the early 90s, and being told that we had to stand boy, girl, as we call, that's our jokey word for, like, you have to stand male, female around the circle. And the rationale that was given for this, and some people still do this, right? It's still out there. The rationale for this is that in order to make polarity, you have to have a male body and a female body next to each other. And obviously all the non-binary people in the room are scratching their heads and going, what? No, like that doesn't. And all the bisexuals in the room are also scratching their heads and going, no, what? And the pansexuals, and and so I was just like, well, you don't need to be actually standing next to the person, and we're not even referencing polarity when we're doing it. So why are we doing this thing? And is it so that men don't get to kiss each other or something? Like, what is this about even? And it just really got my goat, right? I was just really annoyed with it. And so I was really keen to shoot that one down in flames. And then there were other things that I started to notice, like the way that consecrations tend to be done. Man consecrates all the women, or a woman consecrates all the men, or whatever. And again, non-binary people left scratching their heads going, what? And so looking for other ways to do that. And And after I'd written so the reason, actually, the triggering incident, there was sort of several triggering incidents, but the one that kind of
The
really,
boy girl thing is definitely triggering because it's like,
yeah,
I just walked into the space and I'm already feeling like this isn't for me.
yeah, right. I mean, I didn't identify as non-binary back then, but I did always have that non-binary thing going on because non-binary wasn't a concept back in the early 90s, but genderqueer was, and gender fluidity definitely was, and I was like, no, not sure about that. But yeah, the thing, so somebody I knew gave a talk, and it was a really good talk, and it was basically breaking down all the things that are very heterocentric about Wicca. So this would have been, I can't remember exactly, early 2000s, I think, that this talk was given. And he was breaking down, like, these are all the things that are very heterocentric about Wicca. And then he finished, and it was in the LGBT slot at this pagan event, right? So it was a good critique. But then at the end, he just went, well, you know what to do. And everyone's sort of sitting around going, well, no, we don't actually know what to do. And so I'm like, well, I'm going to think up an alternative for I'm going to identify what all the things are and think up an alternative for them. And so that's how the book was born. And then that was all Acts of Love and Pleasure, Inclusive Wicca. And I also did for my MA, I did a study on queer spirituality. And then there was a couple of other triggering incidents, one of which was that a friend of mine who is gay went to a pagan event, and this was a pagan event, so there wasn't actually magic-y things going on. And there was some circle dancing happening, and he'd taken his new boyfriend to this event, and people were dancing around, and this woman kind of jumped in. So obviously he was holding his boyfriend's hand as they were dancing around, and this woman jumped in between them and went, oh no, can't have two men holding hands. And so my friend was absolutely horrified, but being him, he basically kind of squeezed her hand really hard, so she let go and then rejoined onto his boyfriend's hand.
Well, but that connects with what you were talking about with like consent, being a part of inclusivity and stuff like that. Like just approaching someone and putting. I mean, I'm from the Bronx, so like you do not do that unless you are trying to really start some stuff, like physically grab somebody and be like, oh no, you can't do this. Like, wow, the audacity. That's just
yeah, absolutely. And then that reminded me of another thing, which was that when you mentioned the consent thing, there's a lot of hugging goes on at some of these events, and some people find it, because they've got various health conditions, and also autistic people find it overwhelming to be hugged.
To be touched so much.
Yeah. So, like, asking people, I mean, at least one of the things that the pandemic has done for us is at least asking people before you hug them is now more the norm.
Yeah, that happens more. I definitely do that more. I didn't in the past, and that's something that I've learned, and I'm really grateful for it, because now I tend to ask folks that I don't, especially if I don't know them, if they consent to a hug before I just embrace them. Because
I mean, you don't even have to necessarily say anything. You can kind of telegraph. So I'm holding my arms out like a windmill, going,
are you into it?
Yeah, right. Now's a good time for a nice cup of tea and a sit down.
This show is part of the Modern Witch Podcast Network. For more shows like it, visit www.modernwitch.com.
But anyway, that to me is how, a real example. Both of those examples are real examples of how critical this stuff is in making people actually feel included and welcomed and affirmed, And another example was that I was at a Beltane ritual, and this is in All Acts of Love and Pleasure. I describe this. I was at a Beltane ritual, and there was an opportunity in the ritual for people to talk about the joys of love for Beltane. So I would imagine if there were any asexuals present, they were probably like, but also all of the people who stepped forward were talking about heterosexual love.
Right.
And I was stood there and I was thinking, I suppose I should say something, but I just feel really kind of like uncomfortable because I'm probably the only LGBT person here, and because I was looking around and the gay members of the group weren't present, and I thought, well, that's very telling, isn't it? And I actually physically took a step back from the circle, from like the circle of people that were standing around, and thought, oh, I've switched from participant to observer. The little switch went in my brain, and that was the point at which I decided not to make that intervention. But considering this was a public ritual for interested members of the public could just wander up and take part, I didn't think it sent a very good signal,
Yeah. No, and folks, if you are thinking about starting a group, a coven, etc., definitely check out Yvonne's book on that, because it's got a lot of guidance on how to do that. But I'm curious, for those of us who are maybe like approaching covens or attending public rituals and learning more about them, what are some of maybe the telling signs or red flags out there that we might want to look for to let us know whether or not a coven really is an inclusive space? If I were attending a ritual like that that you're talking about, and I did come as an observer, maybe I was curious to see if this was a group I wanted to join, and I'm just on the sidelines watching, what might be some things that might tell me, okay, this group is not really focused on making all witches welcome here?
I think a lot of it, luckily a lot of covens have an outer court training process, so you get a chance, which is like they get a chance to know you, and crucially you get a chance to know them. So I've often listed a bunch of red flags around consent, and does the group try to tell you how to live your life? Does the group try to impose certain ideas or tell you that you can't read certain books? I am aware of coven leaders who've told their LGBT coveners not to read my books.
Wow. Well, so you're not popping unless you have haters, Yvonne.
Right.
That's how you know you did something good.
Oh, right. Yeah. That was basically my take. But thank you for that.
In case you were wondering.
Yeah. Very cool. So yeah, I think it takes time. Obviously, you can't just tell that from one ritual.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, actually, can you? Maybe it's something that you probably have to visit a few times before it becomes clear. But
yeah, but clear warning signs would be things like, do they bang on about do they bang on about heterosexual love all the time to the exclusion of everything else? Do they have rigid gender roles in their rituals? What's their stance on Black Lives Matter or Indigenous? Like one of the things on our coven website basically says, if you don't care about Black Lives Matter and Indigenous land rights and rights generally, like, we're probably not going to get on. So like, don't bother replying, because there are lines in the sand. If you're a homophobic twat, you need not apply. That kind of stuff. but yeah, I think that um, that in terms of spotting a group, I mean, one red flag for me is people who say, "Oh, I don't do politics,"
Mm,
or if they're like, um,
yeah,
I mean,
it's
another
like,
thing that was interesting,
oh.
I spotted a group one time where people had joined the group who didn't look like the type of people who would normally get a tattoo,
Mm,
which is obviously a very, very subjective analysis on my part, I
yeah.
freely confess. Um, and 6 months later, they had a tattoo, and they were kind of like they'd become a clone of the other people in the group.
Mm,
And I'm like, hmm, because if there's one thing about witches and pagans is that we're all pretty individual type of people.
right.
So if people are sort of turning into clones of other people, that's not a good sign.
That's definitely a red flag for sure. Yeah, like if you don't see the diversity uh, amongst the group members itself that you would imagine to be there, you have to ask yourself,
Yeah,
like, why is that? Is it because all of these people like genuinely suddenly wanted to all be the same, or is it because people who are different don't feel included, and so you either fall in line if you can, or you simply don't show up if you're not a part of whatever is going on. So that's definitely a red flag to look out for.
I think so. And it's just the sort of, um, you know, over time, it will become apparent if, say, you're suddenly being asked to do things that are expensive, right? Let's all go to this conference, which turns out to be super expensive. Or, um, hey, everybody buy my book. Because, like, I very, very, I mean, I'm obviously encourage people to buy, who join my coven, to buy my book, but like, it's not mandatory. And I think that's important. And also, but just things like, do they say don't read this book or that book? I mean, sometimes people will say don't read that book because it's got spoilers in it for initiation. That's fair enough, because then they're not saying don't ever read it. They're just saying don't read it if you don't want spoilers, which is
Right,
different.
right.
Um, Also, I think, I mean, one of the things that's kind of weird is um, people taking people using family as an analogy for coven, um,
Mm.
which sounds kind of cute and lovely until
Yeah,
you
I was gonna
actually,
say, you think that that's weird? Why?
yeah. Well, and the reason why is, because I'm not the mother of the people who've joined my coven.
Ah.
So because there's this real temptation to go, okay, high priest and high priestess are mummy and daddy, and we're the kids, and it's like, no, you're adults, right?
Right, right. We're
um
grown-ups, we're
yeah, and
equals.
not everybody, not necessarily had a happy home life, so you don't necessarily want to trigger them with that. And I think that, if somebody's got an unhealthy relationship with their parents, you really don't want them bringing that and projecting it on the high priest and high priestess of the coven. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I think, and the high priestess is a different archetype than um, mother, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
not the same archetype. That's why there's two different tarot cards for that: the Empress and the High Priestess. Um, so I think it's, I, a lot of these things are really subtle, and it's just sometimes it's just what you're comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
Other people might think, yeah, super cute, no problem. Um, but I do, and I'm okay with it. I sometimes refer to people from in other covens as craft cousins, um, and because cousin is appropriately, like,
Yeah.
it's there's an intimacy, but there's a distance, and you know, um, I always like quoting Khalil Gibran about, when you love someone, there you still need that individuality and healthy separation between you.
Mm-hmm.
You come together and then you come apart.
I love that. Coven cousins. I feel like
Yeah,
that. Yeah, that's gonna catch on. Coven cousins. You heard it here first, guys. Don't steal it. I will trademark it when I get a chance. Coven cousins. I
yeah,
think sounds so great. And I think that's a really a valid and insightful point to share, that because I have seen groups that kind of attempt to replicate family structures or talk about people in terms of roles of like traditional family structures, and there might be a lot of stickiness around that doesn't really benefit the group and doesn't necessarily, make everybody feel welcome.
Mm.
So yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. If you're looking for a group, creating one, looking for groups that maybe don't necessarily fall into that sort of traditional family structure, or try to reinforce this idea of like, we're the parents and you're the kids, and type of thing, where everybody is kind of a cousin. They sort of are related to the whole, but they also kind of are separate enough that they've got their own things and maybe their own groups and their own things
Yeah.
going on, but that they know that they're a part of the one, and they contribute in some way to the group.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of it as being a bit like joining a Scottish clan, in that, or an ancient British tribe, or other ethnicity tribe. There is a tribal, and the wonderful thing about tribes as a social grouping is that not everybody was the same in the tribe. It was really important to have a healer and a blacksmith and a shaman and some hunters and some weavers and whatever else, right? So the nice thing about tribes is that they embrace diversity to start with, because if they didn't embrace diversity, they would die.
Right. It's like, wow, everybody in this clan is a blacksmith, really, and no one here can hunt. Unbelievable. How did we get here? No, that's such a good point. Like diversity, because that comes to the question of, we've talked a little bit today about what inclusivity is. We talked a little bit about how to foster it, how to identify it, but we haven't yet really talked about why. Like, why does it matter to be inclusive to other people? Why do we want our spiritual or magical groups to be places where folks of different walks of life feel safe and feel included? And I think you really touched on it beautifully there. That the reason for it is for the success ultimately, and the growth and the strength of the coven. The coven is stronger as a result of having diverse voices and backgrounds and experiences and skill sets and all of that wonderful stuff. Because a well operating group or coven will function like a village or like a tribe, and have all of these different elements of things that need to get done, and having different people to do them is going to put you in a great position, I think, for whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. Whatever your coven's like ultimate goal is, diversity is going to help you get there, I think, smoother, maybe faster.
Yeah. And also I think, in terms of, people often have as their goal doing better magic, right? And
yes.
If your magic is based on a false assumption, which is this, some idea that male and female is the only polarity, for example, or that all gods, all deities are male and female, or whatever your base assumption is, then your magic isn't going to work as effectively, because that's just not true. If your magic is based on, there's like one thing that used to be promoted by some writers in the 80s, which was an idea that you had to be able-bodied to do this stuff. And like, ew, that's horrific, right? People have told me that they've been in covens with blind people, and that blind people are excellent at magic because they can really focus. I've had a lot of dyslexic people in my covens, and dyslexic people are really great at spatial awareness. I was sitting in a room with a couple of dyslexic people, and they started talking about, oh well, when it's winter and the sun rises, the sun will be over there coming in at this angle, and when it's summer it'll be over there coming in at this angle. And I'm just looking at them going, wow, you have superpowers, because I had no idea. Like, they could visualize the whole thing and how the sun was in relation to the room and all of that. And I was just bowled over, because I am not a spatial person. Like, if the predominant thing, if the predominant way of interacting with the world was spatial, I would be neurodivergent. And going back to the point about don't be a dick, like, there were people assuming that black people at predominantly white pagan events, saying, oh, well, you must be interested in the Orishas or Voodoo or whatever. It's like, well, no, not necessarily. Like, you could be interested in whatever you want.
I get that all the time. People
must be
really
good.
I'm like, oh nope, just a Wiccan for 20+ years.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, and yeah, it's okay.
And like, also the other thing is, like, if you Google pagan goddesses on the internet, they will be, the majority of the results on Google Images will be thin and white.
Yes.
And it's maddening.
And young.
And young, yeah. Well, unless you put crone in the thing.
And it's important because, I went to a predominantly white private school, and I was one of, I think, 4 black girls graduating in like a graduating class of like 65 girls. It was also an all-girls school. And I was definitely, without a doubt, welcomed in that school and in that space. I was a scholarship student. My ability to go there financially was being taken care of. Certain accommodations were made for me and my other classmates. We had like special Metro cards because we live in the outer boroughs. We don't live in Manhattan, and so some of us have like 2 transfers on the subway, which costs more, and so we have special Metro cards for that. And so there were accommodations like made to take into account that we were there, and that definitely made me feel welcome. But I did not feel included in the 4 years that I was there, and I left that school with a really great education, but no genuine friendships with anybody. And I was thinking a little bit when I was, just preparing for today and think about my own experiences and the difference between being welcoming and being inclusive. And I was like, man, that school, they did all the things, they checked all the boxes. Like, they made sure that they took into account that not only were we students of color, but we were also coming from a different socioeconomic background, and therefore would need assistance with school trips and things like that. And there were all of these things that they did to make me feel welcome. And I was like, well, what could that school have done? Maybe there's nothing that they could have done to make me feel more included. But you helped me to see that, yes, there was something. And that one thing was making the genuine effort to get to know me. That was something that my classmates, my teachers, the administration of the school, no one ever did.
Wow.
The door was open for me to come in. I wasn't told that I wasn't allowed, but there was no one actually interested in being like, well, what do you bring to this community? What is your life like? What are some of the skills, talents, outlooks, perspectives, etc., that you could share with this community to enrich us? That never happened, and that's, I realize now, looking back, why I left that school with a good education but no friendships, because no one said we care about who you are. And
I mean, one of the things we do at my work is, and I think this is pretty common, to be honest, but each new starter gets assigned a buddy to help them. And there's like get to know you and especially as we're all working from home, it's kind of get to know you over Zoom, but it's there. And I think that there's just this sort of paternalistic assumption that education, from what you've described, education is all a one-way street and there's nothing they could have learned from you, and obviously there's lots they could have learned from you. Right. I recall some time ago when I was after one of the studies I did in my MA was about the connections between the Brahmo Samaj in India and the Unitarians in the UK. And there's a small community of Brahmo Samaj people in London, and they'd always been told that everything that they did was influenced by Unitarianism. What they didn't realize, because nobody said, was that actually they had a massive impact on Unitarianism because their founder wrote some stuff and it influenced Ralph Waldo Emerson, which then actually fed into the pagan movement as well. But like that massively changed Unitarianism. So, there's just this thing of like, hey, everybody, cultural encounter is a two-way street.
Well, so we're running out of time. I want to definitely make sure that I give you a chance to let people know where they can go to continue this conversation with you, to hear more about the things that you have to share. I already told people at the beginning about some of your contact information, but you guys should definitely check out Yvonne on YouTube, if I can just plug you a little bit, because you have like a series, I think, of reclaiming words that I really, really love, because I talk about this quite a bit when it comes to words like prayer and God and things that words that like maybe certain organized religions or groups have kind of taken and held hostage as their own, and words that are special to me that I have to like explain to people that like, no, when I say prayer, I'm not talking about Jesus. We pagans pray too, and things like that. I think that series is super, super cool. I hope you keep doing it, and I'm just encouraging people to check it out because I think they're really informative and fun. They're short little videos, but they're basically just kind of quick deep dives into words that we often maybe associate with things that are like non-pagan, and reclaiming them for us, because oftentimes these words apply to things that we do too. So I think that's a really cool series. So I want everyone to check that out. But what else are you working on or doing that you might want us to take a peek at?
Cool, thank you so much. I'm really glad you liked that series because I thought it was fun and it didn't get that many views. So I'm really glad that you really connected with it. Yay, thank you. So new book coming out hopefully in April is called Changing Paths, and it's about the process of changing from one religion to another. And so part one is leaving another religion, and then part two is joining paganism, and part three is people's own examples of people's specific journeys that they've shared. I've also got a Substack, which needs more love, and I'm thinking about putting some podcast stuff on there. Check out my blog, Dowsing for Divinity. So Dark Mirror, which I gather you're reading in your book club, which is lovely. Don't forget the sequel to Dark Mirror, which is The Night Journey, and that's actually more about groups, but it's also about anti-oppression practice and dismantling white supremacy. Not sure if I got to anywhere near the answer to that, but I tried. Yeah.
We'll explore.
Yeah. And also talking about cultural appropriation and stuff like that. Yeah, so I've actually been taking a bit of a hiatus from YouTube, so I should get back on it. And not sure what my next book's going to be about. Still thinking, one day I'm going to write a novel, but I haven't got anywhere near it yet. Yeah, kind of thinking the next book might be about ritual, but I'm not decided yet.
Yeah. Well, that all sounds awesome. I definitely have played around with the idea of the book club, reading some novels. So, if you do, we'll definitely be excited to read it. So you'll have at least a few readers
Lovely, thank you.
of that. So definitely, folks, make sure to stay in touch with Yvonne. Stay tuned for some of these upcoming works and projects. I highly recommend checking out the Dousing for Divinity blog. I have found it personally very helpful. There is a BIPOC pagan reading list actually that Yvonne shared in that blog some years ago, and I have continued to refer that list to people for years. So it's a very handy blog post. There's a lot of good information in there. So, just check Yvonne out, you guys. Lots of great information for pagans of all walks of life. I want to thank you, Yvonne, so much for being with us today. Thank you for all the insight and
Pleasure.
the personal experiences that you shared, because when we know better, we witch better.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you, witches, for tuning in to another episode of the BetterWitch podcast. New episodes air on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on the BronxWitch Coven YouTube channel and on your favorite podcast platforms. No matter where you're tuning in from, we want to know what you think about today's episode. So make sure to leave us a review wherever you are. A special thank you to BronxWitch Coven members whose membership makes this episode possible. If you'd like to tune in to the live recording sessions, watch the behind-the-scenes footage, and participate in the Q&A for future episodes, consider joining the BronxWitch Coven. You can support this podcast by grabbing some sweet merch over on the BronxWitch merch shop, sponsoring an episode with an ad spot, or following us on Instagram at BetterWitch Podcast. Remember, witches, when we know better, we witch better. See you in the next episode, and blessed be.